Let's talk about video game history stuff, because down here, written up by Insider Gaming, is that the Video Game History Foundation have said that 87% of all classic games are critically endangered. And like I said, this comes from Insider Gaming, saying that just 13% of all games released before 2010 are commercially or readily available today. And that does include remakes, remasters, or re-releases.
That's crazy.
It's absolutely effing horrific. Insider Gaming also say, there's some key points surround how only 12% of the PlayStation 2's library is available, with various outdated US copyright laws blamed as the main reason why. There's a review happening across 2024 to try and rewrite these various laws, and hopefully that'll rewrite some stuff. But it just seems like, for as much as the various preservation efforts are done to let you play most of gaming history, right now you're only really getting access to a tenth of everything from the last 30 plus years.
Man, we've always known that video game archive and video game preservation, like you said, has been bad. But when you see the actual numbers like that, it is just crazy. You know, so many games are not readily accessible. You know, so many games are going to get lost to time, but the sheer volume at which that is happening is genuinely, like, I get upset over it, because not only are those great games now that people can't play, but it's, hundreds and thousands of hours that people have dedicated to their artistry and their expertise over the years, and their entire life's work that is just not accessible, and then therefore not recognized by players and critics or whatever today. And that just doesn't happen in any other medium. There's always, movies that get lost, reels that get destroyed, music, tapes that are, found in a bin 100 years after the fact in a museum or something. But those are rare. Those are a handful of things. Whereas in the video game space, it's just the norm, and that is such
I
a
always
shame.
wonder, and I continue to wonder, because obviously, Insider Gaming's write-up mentions that it's these sort of US laws that are preventing a lot of the copyright side of things. You have to assume that applies to the likes of when the GTA Definitive Edition released, and they couldn't get all the songs again. It was a whole thing when the Tony Hawk's, 1 and 2 got remade, and they did manage to eventually get all the songs, but the initial announcement for those games didn't include everything. I just want a way to play any game. Like, you think of a movie and you go on something like, it's a weird thing because it's kind of service by service. I find that Amazon Prime are better at an archival quality than Netflix don't care about having a history of all movies. Yeah. But Amazon will give you some version of it. 9 times out of 10, or every time I've gone to try and find something, there's been an Amazon thing that I can either buy or rent or whatever. There's not this omni service for gaming. The nearest to it is Xbox, and I do think that Xbox are head and shoulders above PlayStation and Nintendo when it comes to giving you old games. Just because they have so many different games that were either ported to Xbox Live across the 2000s, and you can still play those versions on series systems, or they just have just so much stuff from years gone by kind of thing. In the case of something like Sonic, I was searching for Sonic games, as I do of an afternoon, and they had Sonic Fighters. They had all these different random Sonic games on there, and I was like, oh, I can kind of just sit and play through every single Sonic game. For the vast majority, from Sonic Unleashed to Sonic Generations and whatever, they're all just on Xbox, and they're not on PlayStation, they're not on Nintendo. And I always wonder, is that because most of the third parties would rather charge you for a re-release? And we kind of saw that with Ubisoft, where as much as on Xbox they let you play, Assassin's Creed 3, Black Flag, the original ones. Assassin's Creed 3 then got a re-release, and the original got delisted. Black Flag is getting a remake, so I wonder if they'll delist Black Flag. And it's just that thing where I was like, if you're Johnny Gaming, putting the, meshing the fingers together, making all the business deals, is there just so much money in charging you for that 87% of games that you can't access? Or do you just do right by people and try and ape other mediums and just make it available?
I think there is just too much money to be made. You look at something like Resident Evil 4 and its remake. The original had a bunch of different ports that were constantly resold and made so much money every single time they came to a new console, and then they were able to remake it completely and again make loads and loads of money for that. And I'm fine with that practice as long as it keeps a version of the original intact. Resident Evil 4 was one of the most accessible games in terms of the amount of people who can access it regardless of their machine, and that is a good thing. My issue is that by ignoring a huge percentage of the gaming library, it means that even big franchises aren't safe and secure. I know I talk about it all the time, but Silent Hill is crazy hard to experience not just in its original format, but in any format.
Yeah.
Like, if you want to go and play Silent Hill 1 now in the UK, you're looking at a second-hand market of £70 for that PlayStation 1 disc. And Silent Hill is one of the most, famous video game franchises of all time. So
Same with Metal Gear?
Yeah, if I look at stuff like Metal Gear, look at stuff like Crash Bandicoot, look at stuff like Silent Hill, and think about how hard it is to access the original versions of those games, but in some cases just any versions of those games. I just think about all of the hidden gems, all of the stuff that wasn't deemed popular enough to get a remaster that's fallen through the cracks. I mean, say what you want about film, right? But at least in terms of the canon of great movies, it's not just the popular stuff that is accessible today. You can go into the history of film, you can find some of the most obscure stuff on the planet and cherish it. I just don't think we can do that with video games in anywhere near the same way, and that's a shame, because then it does build a library. It builds a canon of what is accepted and what is deemed worthy enough to be preserved. And who gets to decide that? Just because something sold well? Just because something scored high? Nah, people have been making great stuff outside of those parameters for decades, and I want to play that stuff. That's more interesting.
Absolutely. It's one of those things where, like, when they started building the PlayStation Plus, like the new version of PlayStation Plus, all the PS1 games and everything else, all 5 of them that they managed to put on the archive service, I was like, that's brilliant, because you have so many to pick from. And if they need to go back and do those deals to get Soul Reaver on a PlayStation 5, then just do it. Like, it's one of those things where I just don't know enough about the potential licensing side of it. And I also don't know enough about, I don't know who's, if anyone, is paying Amazon to archive some ancient, like Lawrence of Arabia or something on Amazon. Like, does that go between the different distributors? Like, what does it mean to have that movie archived? Does it cost something or not? And are the third parties culpable? Are they, maybe they not want to pay those fees? Would they rather just hang on and do a remake later down the line? I feel like it's a much bigger discussion, but I feel like the Video Game History Foundation themselves just sort of like laying it out, just saying that 87% of your potential childhood is not accessible is ridiculous. And it's one of those things where I ended up getting a Steam Deck specifically because I wanted an emulation machine. And I could have got a PC, but at the same time I wanted something that was more accessible and I can use on the train and whatever. But I'm still shelling out £1,000 to get something, to get access to these old games, unless, like you said, you get lost in the retro market, which is in itself receiving a humongous boost right now in terms of the average price for old games, just because the accessibility to these games is just so scarce. Like, you can't just go play Metal Gear Solid 1 unless you have a PS1 mini or you're waiting for the Master Collection.
And that's becoming increasingly jarring to me as someone who does this job, because as we get older and as generations kind of pass by, our reference points aren't even accessible to people who might have been too young to play them at the time or weren't even around at the time. And it's like, how can we have this dialogue when the stuff I'm referring to, someone else can only experience secondhand? Someone can only watch walkthroughs of it or watch people like us talk about it. Like, that's not, to me, that's not a solid foundation to build any kind of critical anything
That's a really good point.
of,
Yeah, well, if we were doing, we've talked about like every now and then over the last sort of few years of doing this job, like, why don't we have some sort of boot club style thing where you tell people, oh, hey, we're going to play this next week, go play it, you got a week, go play a few levels and check in with us the week after and we'll talk about it. But like you said, they might just not have access to those games. Like, there's no way of actually saying, like, oh, this is the definitive place to go play Soul Reaver or whatever it is.
Well, I know, again, I know it's not as easy as it is for film. I know there are licensing issues like you mentioned. I know there are issues with the hardware. You can't just pop a Metal Gear Solid 1 disc into a PS5 and expect it to work. I know it's not magic like that. No. But that said, when we talk about, stuff that I think is quite, mainstream and popular, for instance, if we're talking about the best Spider-Man games, I kind of have to second guess myself sometimes, because it almost feels like the conversation is moot before it started, because those Spider-Man games, like, they're going to cost people a lot of money to get, or they might not be accessible at all. Like, if we talk about Shattered Dimensions or Web of Shadows, which we always discuss as one of the most underrated and best Spider-Man games,
maybe the most overlooked Spider-Man game,
Absolutely. But I kind of start to second guess myself, because I'm like, yes, it makes for an interesting discussion, but the average person isn't going to be able to go out and experience that unless they own the machine that it was on and manage to track down a wildly inflated copy. And it's crazy that can happen to, again, a character as big as Spider-Man.
It also speaks to how ingrained the assumption of forking out more money is, because whenever we have those conversations about anything that was licensed, like you talk about any movie tie-in or whatever, there's an assumption that you won't be able to play it.
Yeah.
There's an assumption that it's expired and the company hasn't forked out the money to keep it online to make sure it's available to you. Something like Spidey, the PS1 Spider-Man game is my personal favorite, and I have no access to that. I have a version of it on Steam Deck, but I have no official access point to that.
Hey, you get a PlayStation 1. I've got the original copy.
Oh, yeah?
I'll send it your way.
If retro prices weren't 60 English pounds, then I would dive in.
This is it, man. Like, all year, I've been wanting to buy Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, the PS1 versions, because I haven't played them since I was a kid, and in the case of Resident Evil 3, never managed to completely finish front to back. And yet, those games are as much as a new price PlayStation 5 game in some cases. You know, I'm looking to pay £40, £50 on the secondhand market. And I've had to keep putting it off because I can't justify forking out all of that, especially at a cost of living crisis when we're trying to also buy and play through Final Fantasy 16 and what have you. So it's
Gollum's
sucks.
having your arm off.
Gollum absolutely is, certainly is. So it just sucks from that perspective. But what sucks even more are the online games that have had their servers turned off. That even if you did track down a copy, you wouldn't be able to play. That's
a whole other thing.
It's an entirely different conversation, right? Because it's like, how do you archive something that literally isn't up and running anymore, where even if you did make it accessible from a production standpoint, no one's keeping the lights on from the server's perspective, so you can't even experience it at all. I'm gonna get on my soapbox right now because I loved Call of Duty Warzone.
Yes,
Scott Tilver, not sure if you know this, played it all the way through lockdown, and they've taken the original version of that game offline now. Like they kind of whittled it down to the map that was just Caldera, which was its final big kind of content drop. But now they've taken that offline, and all you can play is Warzone 2.0. That's 500 hours of my life. 2 years of my lockdown experience, that is now just a memory. That is now just a bunch of YouTube videos and people who were there at the time. No one would be able to experience now what I experienced for those 500 hours. And what a bloody shame that is.
I tell you what, it is really nuts when you start lining it up with like other mediums. Like if we talk about brilliant past albums, maybe I'm telling you about the first Metallica album or the Beatles or something, you can go listen to it. You can listen to it within like 10 minutes. If we talk about Mortal Kombat Shaolin Monks or Dead to Rights or Soul Reaver or whatever, you just can't. You just can't do it. And it's kind of nuts when you really start breaking it down that way comparatively with other easily accessible, or what should be easily accessible media. If you think of a film, you can go find it, like I said, on Amazon, or you'll be able to find some sort of streaming archive online. YouTube's taken quite a lot of that stuff up as well. And where you can just pay some money and get it through your Google account or something. Games just don't have that. Like Steam's pretty good for it, but only if you're on PC. Like it's on the console space, you are like boxed in. You will get exactly what's on that storefront, and there's no attempt to go wider than that.
And in my head, again, I know it's difficult, but in my head, there's no reason for it. Like we're not
no like active business reason.
That's it. We're not talking about an underdog industry anymore. We're not even necessarily talking about a small growing industry. Like this is the most successful entertainment sector. Like a new GTA comes out, it makes $1 billion in 3 days, where it would take, you know, a Marvel, even the biggest Marvel movie, a good few weeks to reach that milestone. Like the money that is involved in this industry, the amount of popularity the industry has, the amount of people it reaches. To me, there's no excuse to not have some of that funnel back into the preservation of the art form, because that art form needs to be appreciated, especially to go back to stuff that just got it off the ground to begin with.
Well, my thing as well is that I love the likes of No Clip. I know Danny O'Dwyer. It's either him or Danny Dyer. Danny O'Dwyer over on No Clip just bought a whole bunch of archival tapes and archival materials to try and preserve some games as well. But I feel like recently, you know, you've either got documentaries about old games and like sort of purchases that happened. The Completionist bought a whole bunch of Nintendo 3DS games, but on the eShop before it shut down. There's a really good video over there, and with him figuring out how to even buy that many games on a 3DS. That's one thing. You've got No Clip, like I said. You've got I mention Atari 50 all the time because that is in itself a playable version of Atari history, where, you know, like it'll be 20 odd years of games that is on that cartridge / disc or wherever you play it, and you play through like a Talking Heads documentary that dips in and out of the games themselves. I love the idea of various legacy companies, Ubisoft or EA or whoever, figuring out their own versions of Atari 50. Like, do the interviews, get the people back in who made them, and make sure that those games are available and tell those stories. You'll make money that way. way. If you're that bothered about the bottom line, there are still other ways to make money that way. Give me a Mortal Kombat collection, Edward. Why not? He keeps tweeting about it. Big old Boone. He's always saying like, "Oh, does anyone want Shaolin Monks?" Yes, we do, Ed. Yes.
Your friend and mine and our lovely co-worker Ryan recently got a haul of PS1 and PS2 games. He posted
Shout out to Ryan Nicholson, one of the finest editors of the land.
And he managed to buy Mortal Kombat
Shaolin Monks, I know.
And I just thought, I've never been more jealous of a living or dead person because I want to play that game so much.
It was the first thing I downloaded on my Steam Deck, and it's great. It's a lovely game, but just make it available.
This is it, right? There might be people listening to this thinking, you two are old men. You know, you're old. No one cares. No one wants to play Gran Turismo, in the words of Jim Ryan. And, you know, there's a...
Sony boss says no one wants to play a PlayStation game. Carry on.
There's obviously a huge amount of people who emulate stuff on Steam, like you've alluded to. But to me, man, the onus shouldn't be on the fans. Like, you don't expect fans to remaster a Blu-ray of a beloved movie. You know what I mean? I know we keep making these comparisons, but it's just, in no other industry would that be the norm, or would that be accepted as just, that's what you gotta do. And that is... nightmarish, because I think you made a great point there by pointing out someone something as big as Metallica as an entity. Like, you can just go on Spotify or whatever and listen to their entire catalog, their entire history, front to back, and there's a joy in that.
One of my biggest, I'm cutting you off again. One of my biggest problems with the industry is the lack of optics that we have on video game development, the lack of understanding that the average gamer has as to how games are put together, the budgetary side of it, the coding side of it, the different licensing deals, etc. Like I said, there are so many ways to educate the masses on that stuff. Every big budget movie has a making of. Like, I mean, if you grew up with DVDs, then you probably likely had all the making of discs for that stuff, or you put the director's commentary on. And games have experimented with director's commentaries every now and then, but I feel like overall, if you could delve into all that stuff, it would only be a net positive. Like, you're only going to educate people as to where IPs came from. And again, if you really care about the bottom line and you're Ubisoft, why not do a history of Assassin's Creed that lets you play different levels, that lets you access those different games? It'll only make people give a bigger hoot about Assassin's Creed Mirage.
That's it. Like, I find, I love bubbling within franchises.
Yes.
I find I appreciate the franchises that I play so much more when I can chart that development, where I can see where they came from and where they are today. Playing through all of the Devil May Cry games, playing through all of the Ninja Gaiden games, Metal Gear Solid, God of War was a big one.
All the Kirby's,
mate. Definitely not the Kirby's, but maybe all the Crocs, maybe all the
all two of them.
The Gecko.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'll play those. It just, like you said, it makes you appreciate that development more. It makes the franchise feel more significant, and surely it only, makes for a more passionate fan base that's more entrenched within these games and not just what's fresh from these games. I will say, as kind of a potentially final thing on this point, I don't know if we're going to keep going.
We should probably go home at some point today.
We probably should, but I've been away for the long weekend, man.
He's got the banter.
I don't got the banter, but I've been excited to be on the podcast. I will say, like, I love that we're in this era now of remasters and remakes. Genuinely, I referenced Resident Evil at the start of this podcast, or the start of this point, and Resident Evil 4 Remake is my favorite game of the year by far at the moment, but I don't want to ever live in a world where Resident Evil 4 Remake replaces the original. I would rather, for as much as I love it, I'd rather it not exist.
Yes.
Because even when a remaster project or a remake project only tweaks certain aspects, maybe it's a slight shift in the art style, maybe it is literally just, adding more pixels in there or adding more text, high quality textures in there. To me, it's a transformative thing. You look at the Crash Insane trilogy, which I love and I thought was amazing, would recommend it to everyone, but I don't like that the original Crash games aren't accessible, because you could say the remaster does everything they did and maybe even a little bit smoother, maybe even a bit better, but to me, like, even the subtle changes in art style make the original valuable, because that's, to me, big enough to kind of shift what is my favorite and what isn't. I like the weird 90s polygonal harshness of the original Crash.
Yeah.
While I appreciate the new art style, I'll always love the original so much more, because there's a beauty to that. It's not just because, like, they didn't just do that because that's what the limitations at the time were. Like, they worked around those limitations to create something special. And I think we often ignore that when we remaster games and we update games.
Yes.
We assume that this was always the original intention, and the games only didn't look like that because they weren't able to look like that. And it's like, nah, that's not always the case. There's artistry there, even if it is technically inferior. And I don't want to get into a world where we just say, oh, screw the guys who made that game.
Yes.
This is the real version.
You talk about like the amount of different companies that are trying to monetize nostalgia, but the irony there being that they'll take the old thing and then try and do this approximate version of it for a new audience, when the most directly monetizable thing would be actually releasing the original.
Yeah.
Let people have those original sound effects, those original feelings that they had, and maybe touch up the frame rate. That's all I ever want from my quote-unquote remakes. I just want the old version available again. And so there's maybe a way to do that feels like it taps back into that nostalgia more directly.
I still think the Master Chief Collection did loads wrong. It did
Yes.
loads and loads and loads wrong. But those games, or at least in terms of combat, evolved, like giving you the option to toggle between the new version and the old version. I want to see that as standard.
That always felt like it
everything.
should be the standard.
And
Yeah.
I can't believe that wasn't more widely adopted. Other games have done it since, but considering how many remake and remaster projects we've had, nowhere near enough, in my opinion.
No, and especially, like that's one of those things. It's like you want to remind people how far we've come, and like try and get a new audience in, or maybe like show a new audience why it was a big deal in the first place. But yeah, things like that. Like I said, like I mentioned the Atari 50 thing as a general approach. The Master Chief Collection could also be a general approach. If you really want to do a new graphic style, just let people have that toggle. Like it's just all of it hovers around the overall point that we have accepted that most of our gaming history is not accessible, and that's the overall. That's the biggest problem with this stuff.